Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and we meet again towards Parashat Vayeshev. As we're speaking, Rav Chaim Druckmann, Shlita, 90 years old, is fighting for his life. He's an old man and he's very ill with COVID-19, and he is in intensive care in Hadassah Hospital, and we're davening for his well-being, for his refuah shlema, and I'm dedicating this short shir and Dvar Torah for his refuah shlema. Even though we're coming towards Hanukkah, I want to talk for a moment about Seder night. Seder night begins with Kiddush. Okay, we understand, we start with Kiddush. And then all of a sudden we're washing our hands. Okay, after Kiddush we wash our hands. That sounds like a regular Friday night, regular Shabbos morning. But then we do something interesting. We do karpas. What is karpas? Karpas is a type of vegetable that is dipped into salt water. Different traditions about which type of simple vegetable it should be, a potato, a radish, a celery, or whatever it might be, is dipped into salt water. What is that all about? What is really happening here? So what's really happening here is when we sit down to say the night, it's all about the children asking questions. And the basic question a child would ask is, Daddy, Mommy, what are we talking about this evening? And we say we're talking about the Exodus from Egypt, with great miracles, how we got out of the land of slavery with incredible miracles. So he says, tell me, how did we get to be slaves in the first place? How did we get to be slaves in Egypt? And then the answer is, the father and the mother say, the story is a long story. It all began because of a certain episode that happened a long, long time ago. And the episode starts with Joseph, who was the favorite son of his father Yaakov. And because he was a favorite son, he bought for him a special coat. And the pasuk says, Ketonet Pasim. In modern Hebrew, Pasim would be stripes. But he didn't buy him a coat of stripes. That is not the correct translation. Pasim is from the word we know from Megillat Esther, that the king wore chul karpas otechelet. He wore the most expensive silk fabric, which is called karpas. And when you have a garment made of all kind of pieces of karpas, so it becomes a ketonet pasim. It's a cloak made out of this very special royal silk. And that is what Yaakov Avinu bought for Yosef. And the special silk coat. And what happened to this silk coat? When Joseph went down to his brothers, and his brothers, at first instance, decided to kill him, and then at second thoughts, they put him in a ditch, and in a hole in the ground, and then eventually they sold him out as a slave to Egypt. What they did was they took his coat made of this special silk, and they dipped it in the blood of an animal that they slaughtered and brought it to their father to deceive their father, to say, for him to think that his son was attacked by wild animals and was killed by wild animals. And the truth is, they sold him as a slave to Egypt. Now, the whole thing started with dipping the cloak of karpas, of ketonet pasim, in the blood of this animal. So that is how the whole story started. Then we start our Seder night by dipping the karpas, which is a type of vegetable, in salt water, just to remember how this whole story started. The whole story started in Parashat Vayeshev, which is this week's Parsha, which is all about the terrible plight of Yosef. And eventually, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world midah keneged midah, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu's justice in the world is to put things into balance, and therefore, because all the tribes sold Yosef into slavery, so eventually to Egypt, therefore eventually they were all sold as slaves, they were all sent down as slaves, and we were 210 years in slavery in Egypt. But let's go back for a moment and look at Yosef's plight. And Yosef's plight was not so simple. It's true, he had a long walk from Hebron all the way to Shechem. It's a long, long way to walk all by himself. And I'm sure Yaakov felt very guilty afterwards. They sent him all by himself. And he went all that way, and he couldn't find his brothers, which was very distressful. And then they said, and then he had to move on to Dotan. They hated him. They threw him into a pit, as we mentioned before. Then they sold him. And once he was sold, he was put into a certain home that they got into trouble as well, not for his fault. But then he was put into prison. How low can you get? How low can you get? You're a slave that is in a prison of slaves in Egypt, disconnected from his family, from his friends. He's a nobody in the land of nobodies. And he is just lost. I'm sure the conditions there in this cell, in the prison for slaves in Egypt was terrible. He got to the lowest point in his life. And what does he do at the lowest point in his life? We have to read this carefully. He finds two people that look a bit grumpy. And he says to them, hey guys, what's the matter? What's happened to you? He sees Sahar Mashkim and Sahar Alfim, the person in charge of the wines and the person in charge of the baking in the house of Paro, and they were sulking. Why are you sulking? And he tried to listen to them, and he did a chesed. He went out of his way to listen to their problem. They had a terrible dream. So he solved the dream for them, but he just listened to them. He did an act of kindness. And because of this act of kindness, next week's parasha already, he becomes the second to the king. He said to Paro, he becomes one of the most important people in the Middle East at the time, because he's giving food at the time when there is a famine. But it all started, the turning point was one small act of kindness. And it's just, this whole story comes to teach us what one small act of kindness can do. I remember speaking to a survivor, an old lady, who said to me that she went through a few camps and the death march and all terrible story. I said, how did you survive all this? So she said, well, I'll tell you the truth. The Talmud in Brachot, Daf Yud, says the following, that Afilu cherev chada munachat al tzavaro shel adam, which means even when there is a sharp sword sitting on your neck about to kill you, you shouldn't give up. You should still hope for rachamim. You should still hope that somebody will have mercy on you. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will have mercy on you. Never give up. That is the way it's usually taught. But I was taught differently, said this old lady. I was taught that even if you've got a sharp sword on your neck, you still have to have rachamim. You have to still have mercy. You still have to find a way to do acts of kindness with people that are even in a worse situation than you are. And she said, I had lice, I had illnesses all the time during the Holocaust. I looked for people who were in a worse situation than I was and tried to do an act of kindness. Ladies and gentlemen, one act of kindness can change the root of history. And that's the story of Yosef. And therefore, we're about to light the Hanukkah candles. And you say to yourself, I'm lighting one little candle. What difference does it make? One little candle can make all the difference. One act of kindness can make all the difference. Olam chesed yibaneh. The world is built from acts of kindness. And we have to learn from the story of Yosef that we can bring Geula Shlema, in fact, to the world. How? Through acts of kindness. B'mheira b'yameinu amen.